U.S. President Joe Biden has condemned Russia's threats to mobilize more troops in the wake of its unrelenting onslaught in Ukraine. Biden was addressing the United Nations General Assembly, attended by heads of state from other parts of the world as well and foreign dignitaries. He's accused Moscow of violating the United Nations Charter by invading Ukraine in an attempt to collapse its sovereignty. Biden has also called for reform of the United Nations Security Council to enable the organization to better respond to global challenges. Let's talk about this with Brooks Spector, an international relations expert. Welcome, Brooks, to Daytime Update. So, President Biden spoke of the Russian invasion of Ukraine ending on just terms, but how does one even see that as a possibility when you consider hours earlier President Putin had announced that hundreds of thousands of reservists were now being mobilized to go into Ukraine?
Well, good afternoon. Good to be with you. I mean, one of the first image that comes to my mind is the old adage that people tell people who are engaged in difficult things: if you're in a hole, don't keep digging further. And that, I think, was the general tenor of Joe Biden's message to Vladimir Putin. You're already in a hole. Please don't dig any deeper. In fact, begin to think about how to get out of the hole. And obviously, the way to get out of the hole, at least if Joe Biden's words were to be taken directly and simply, would be to announce the withdrawal of troops from Ukraine by the Russians. Instead, as your lead-in indicates, the Russians have decided on a limited mobilization of several 100,000 new troops. Now, it's going to take some months before those new people, those new soldiers, those new personnel actually have any real impact on the battlefield. And a lot can happen between now and then, not the least of which is the rolling in of the severe Russian/Ukrainian winter, which makes military maneuvers that much more difficult. But one part of Vladimir Putin's speech, the pre-recorded speech that was released on Wednesday morning, was the one that I think was even more chilling, and that, of course, was a not so implicit threat to use nuclear weapons if things don't go well, and that should make us all sit up, pay attention, and lose some sleep. We should not be in a position where nuclear weapons are being loosely bandied about as potential game changers in a limited military conflict. That way lies a very unpredictable pathway in the future. As a practical matter, the United States under Joe Biden and the rest of the Western nations are already taking a variety of financial and economic sanction steps, and they'll tighten them, and they'll continue to supply more and even more advanced weaponry to the Ukrainians, who presumably will be able to make good use of them, at least given from the experience that we saw in the last week or so.
So, in Moscow, President Putin, even in his address last night, yesterday morning, our time, still felt he was justified in what he says is a special military operation in Ukraine. He says it's to protect people who are Russian, to protect the sovereignty of Russia as a state. And these soldiers are going in. You've got the Americans and the rest of the West who, as you would have just said, are still willing at this point, it appears, to continue to support Ukraine. Yes, not with boots on the ground, but with money and military hardware. That then suggests that we're moving even further away, doesn't it, from an actual withdrawal of those soldiers that are in Ukraine today?
Well, I think as a practical matter, it's quite true. There's no indication, there's no evidence, and there are no intimations that the Russians are scaling down their invasion or scaling down their attacks. But let's put it this way: if there was another bit of fighting in which Russian military sustained yet more losses of both men, material, and territory, you may well have a situation where Vladimir Putin decides that, okay, it's enough, maybe we should simply declare victory and go home. I wouldn't bet on that. No, I wouldn't take that bet. But it remains a possibility that when, as I say, at some point you stop digging the hole. In fact, I'm writing something about this morning, and one of the things that I have observed is a column that was written yesterday by New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, and he sets out a couple of scenarios of the way forward, some of them not so good, some of them better. But my observation would be that ultimately all wars end somehow, some way, either through a victory or simply the exhaustion of the participants. And when that happens, then it's time to figure out what happens next.
So President Biden, speaking yesterday at the UN, was perhaps less scathing, shall we say, of Russia, given the troubles between the two countries. He said that there's no interest in, from the US side at least, of going into a cold war with China. China also has much more pleasant relations with Russia, and I wonder if perhaps there may be a role for the Chinese to play in de-escalating developments in Europe.
Well, if you've observed, I think that in the last several days, both the Chinese and the Indians at the in various international fora, notably the Shanghai Cooperation Commission that takes place obviously in Shanghai, in China, the Chinese had indicated to the Russians that their support is not unlimited, and that in the case of the Indians, that the time for war is over and the time for something that replaces it is around. The Russians obviously cannot count on many friends internationally that matter a lot in terms of practical support. Those economic and financial sanctions are beginning to bite. They are beginning to harm. Let me just point out one other thing. We've talked a little bit about that increase in the call-up of reserves. Various people have noted for us that once that happened, every seat on every train and bus and plane leaving Russia to a country where you don't need a visa to enter, if you're a Russian, they suddenly filled up, presumably with young men who might otherwise worry about being called up for military service. That indicates a certain degree of dissatisfaction with the war. There have been demonstrations in Russian cities, even though the possibility of being criminally charged for that lingers over any participation. And the country's most famous or best loved folk singer came out publicly in support of ending the war. So Vladimir Putin's options are not unlimited, and the restrictions on him in making things happen within his own country to support this war effort are not unlimited. Just
on limited options, among the European countries as well as the United States, for example, they're going into the winter months now. There's already an issue, a concern around a potential shortage of energy. Yes, the UK has announced a plan to sort of, if you will, shield people from the worst of the energy crisis in terms of pricing. Could that lead, do you think, to a change in attitudes among domestic populations, perhaps being less supportive of their government's sanctions and continued support for Ukraine?
Well, it could. I'm not sure it will. At least at this point, support for supporting Ukraine, let's put it that way, remains high in most nations that matter, with the arguable exception of, say, Hungary. And we still should remember that the people in Finland and Sweden, surprisingly, after having had a position of neutrality in the old East-West conflict, elected to decide to join NATO and to apply for immediate entry. So the energy issue is something that will affect people. There's no way around it. I mean, it will be colder in a home in Germany than it was last year. It may be harder to obtain fuel supplies in a factory, and it may slow down production or make the costs go up. But a lot of those countries have already made serious plans to get a hold of resources from elsewhere. And let's just add that petrochemical resources are not scarce in the world market these days. The price is off of where it was some time ago, and the United States is making some effort to figure out how to supply the deficits as well. I'm not sure, but talk to me in 2 months' time when the temperature in a German home is down around 15 degrees, if that happens, and they're running out of coats and jerseys to put on inside, then maybe there'll be that question.
Brooke Spector, good to speak to you.